All right. Well, hello and welcome to the third and final Kessler conversation of the spring 2023 semester. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the awesome privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library at Emory University, which is the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. Consistent with our mission for the collection, which is not only to collect and preserve the works of the 16th century, but to teach and learn from them, these Kessler conversations present opportunities to learn from some of the world's top scholars about the events of the early modern period, why we might be interested in them, and what we might learn from them today. This semester, we've been exploring the topic printed text and hypertext, asking how technological and cultural innovation of the 16th century might inform communities today who ourselves are dealing with quite a bit of innovation. To help us today, I'm excited to welcome from quite literally the other side of the globe, Professor Jenny Spinks. Professor Spinks is the Hanson Associate Professor in History at the University of Melbourne. She researches Northern Europe in the period from 1450 to 1700, with a focus on print culture, material culture, and the social and religious impact of disasters and wonders. In addition to her career of teaching and writing, she has co-curated exhibitions of early modern print at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne and the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Her publications include Monstrous Births and Visual Culture in 16th Century Germany and Disaster, Death, and the Emotions in the Shadow of the Apocalypse, 1400 to 1700, which she co-edited with Charles Zika. She currently leads the Australian Research Council Discovery Team project, Albrecht Dürer's Material World in Melbourne, Manchester, and Nuremberg, which has some really exciting work that's forthcoming. She gave me a little bit of a preview. So today, she joins us to talk about that very topic, entitling our conversation, Devouring the Book in Renaissance Nuremberg, which is a reference, as we will soon see, to a famous image by Albrecht Dürer, who is certainly a favorite artist in the Kessler collection, and I suspect will be all of our favorite artists after we talk today. So Professor Spinks, thank you so much for being with us today, which is quite early for you today, so I appreciate that.
Thanks, Bo, for having me to come along. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, I want to remind those who are joining us live that you also can participate through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So Professor Spinks and I will talk, but as you have questions, please add them there. And if we have time at the end, I will relay them to her. So let's get started with talking about Dürer. So as I've mentioned, you focused on the late 15th and early 16th century artist, Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg. So just to provide a general orientation, can you give us a little bit of biographical information on Dürer and help us understand why you think he's so significant for understanding this period in history?
Thanks, Bo. And it's just a pleasure for me to have a chance to talk about Dürer and his love for books and the impact that he had on book culture. But he is, of course, also one of the most famous artists, full stop, of the Renaissance, the German Renaissance, but also the Renaissance across Europe more broadly. He didn't start out as an artist. He was one of 18 children, only 3 survived to adulthood, born in 1471. And his father was a Hungarian immigrant to Nuremberg and a goldsmith. And his wife, Barbara, you can see Albrecht the Elder and Barbara, born Holper there. Barbara was the daughter of a goldsmith with whom Albrecht the Elder trained. So they set up in Nuremberg. And Albrecht Dürer himself, Dürer, originally trained in this field, but he moved to painting, actually a less prestigious field, under the leading Nuremberg artist, Michael Wohlgemuth. And as he continued to work as an artist, very early on, he demonstrated and developed exceptional skills in printmaking. And it's no accident that he trained in metalworking, because the kind of skills that you need to cut a woodblock or cut an engraving to engrave, really draw very strongly on metalworking skills. He's a leading figure, a core figure of how we think about the Renaissance in Germany and more broadly. But it's really important to note that he was networked into other artists, craftspeople and scholars, and the environment in which he worked was crucial. And he was very affected by his contact with others and also by his opportunities to travel. So he traveled as a young journeyman in the 1490s, going to places like Basel and into the region of Alsace, before he set up his own studio in Nuremberg as a master craftsman. Basel was a hive of activity for printed books. We'll see a little bit more on that later. He also sought out the master printmaker Martin Schongauer, really the leading printmaker before him, although he arrived after his death. He had really important trips to Italy. Again, that'll come up again a little bit later, especially to Venice, both in the 1490s and then a decade later. And towards the end of his life, he travelled to the Netherlands when he sought out the renewal of his imperial pension because he'd been very close to and supported by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who had recently died. He also sought out business opportunities and the wonders of the natural world. And just to take us to the end of Dürer's life, just to go from that amazing 13-year-old sitting there who's done this incredible silver point drawing. It's a very exacting art, silver point. You can't make any mistakes and rub them out. You have to get it right the first time. But here he is as a 13-year-old with prodigious talent. By the end of his life, when he's in the Netherlands, one of the things he's doing is trying to see a whale on a beach because he's got this incredible curiosity about the natural world. That's not very successful, but he catches a disease, possibly malaria, and that really weakens him. And so in his 50s, he suffers from poor health, although he's still energetically working at various projects. Again, we'll see some more about those. But he died in 1528, and so the 500th year anniversary of his death is on the way. He ran his workshop alongside his wife, Agnes. I don't have a picture of her there, although he did create an image of her, which is quite beautiful, a drawing. And he trained some artists who would also become well-known, like Hans Baldung Green. But he's regarded as an extraordinary artist for a number of reasons. And I've got a sketch here, a watercolour sketch, and also an engraving there on the right. So you have to, obviously you have to sort of immerse yourself in his art, but he's made all these iconic images, which I'm sure many people watching in today will, or looking at this recording later, will be very familiar with. But a few core reasons that I'd pull out is firstly his incredible technical skill. It's quite astonishing, his capacity to render things in fine detail and to work with a plate or a woodblock with a degree of finesse that had not been shown before. But also he's astonishing because of his inventiveness in composition. We'll see this particularly in his Apocalypse cycle later on, where he takes imagery that was not new, but he does something extremely new with it. And I've put up this image of the Great Turf, drawing that he did not for a wider audience, but as a study for himself, because it really reminds us about how he had this extraordinary capacity to closely observe the world around him and make us look again at the natural world if we see it through his eyes. And these nature studies are very well known, although they weren't done for sale at the time. But the project that I'm on, which I hope I'll get to say a little bit more about later, is also we're very interested in how he similarly pays incredible attention to the wonderful world of manufactured objects, of material culture, of life going on around him in the city of Nuremberg. And I put up, this is one of his famous 3 Meisterstücke or master prints, Night, Death and the Devil. And I just draw your attention to, for instance, the armour that the knight is wearing. And the city of Nuremberg, where he lived, was famous for metalwork, including armour. This brings together a lot of things. So the dog and the surrounding landscape had this intense realistic skill that draws you into the dark world of the knight's journey. And then we've got in the background this really inventive figure of the devil. So it sort of encapsulates all those things that make Dürer such a special artist.
Yeah, the level of detail of some of these prints is just unbelievable, and it boggles the mind. It's interesting that you highlight his kind of technical background as a child and through his family. I think oftentimes we separate technical skill and kind of artistic imagination, and he seems to bring those two things together. Now, you talked a lot about geography and his travels and how important they were to him, but his hometown, right, Nuremberg, is a particularly interesting case, particularly within the context of the Reformation. So you've written somewhere, quote, Dürer's home was the primary locus of his deep engagement with the material world. So again, Nuremberg's interesting. It's an early acceptor of Lutheran reforms. And yet, of course, during most of his lifetime, Nuremberg is a city that is, thoroughly medieval Catholic. So can you help us understand a little bit about why Nuremberg as place is significant for Dürer? And then maybe a little bit about how the Reformation itself influences Dürer, a bit later in his life.
Thanks, Bo. Yeah, Nuremberg itself is a fascinating city, and it's as much a topic for our project as Dürer himself, actually. Of course, you saw in the picture of Albrecht Dürer the Elder, he's holding his rosary beads, and there's a really strong But there's a brotherhood of the rosary in Nuremberg, so the rituals around the rosary are very strong there. But let me say a few things about Nuremberg, because it's such a significant city in the Renaissance, even though it's, today a relatively minor German city in various ways. It was a free imperial city. I'll say a bit more about where this image is from in a minute. And it had special privileges from the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, especially since the 14th century, and the promulgation of a thing called the Golden Bull under Emperor Charles IV in 1356. And what this meant in practical terms was that the first diet of any reign of the new emperor had to be held there. So the first meeting when all the electors and the key officials from across the empire met after a new emperor came to the throne effectively, that would be in Nuremberg. So this gave tremendous political clout and economic clout to the city. It was uniquely well situated for the production of prints and books and all sorts of other objects, and the development of audiences for them, because it was set at the crossroads of European trade routes. And it was a sort of clearinghouse for all sorts of goods, as well as a locus for technology and manufacturing. So the first paper mill in Northern Europe, for instance, was there. And one of the really notable things about the city was the invention of new trade-protected metalworking techniques. And as you can imagine, these are both really crucial things for book production, and which fostered a really vibrant book trade after the developments in Mainz of movable type in the mid-15th century. And so Nuremberg was really there alongside, at times, leading other major printing centres like Augsburg, Ulm, Basel. It had a really interesting governmental structure. It had a patrician form of government. You can see there's a castle there, but in fact, it doesn't really have a lord. It's or the position of the lord is greatly reduced. I won't go into the details, but what you have during Dürer's lifetime is a patrician form of government, council sort of run, and very interestingly, no guild structure. So artists were directly under the oversight of the council, not of their own guilds. This had some downsides, but it had some tremendous upsides, because it meant there was less boundary keeping between borders. So someone like Dürer could work across media, and also more openness to outsiders. So Dürer's father, for instance, could come from Hungary and build up a career which rose to the heights of being commissioned by Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. It's a very intellectually interesting city. It doesn't have a university, but it has a very active humanist circle with private and religious libraries. Dürer's closest friend is a leading humanist called Willibald Pirkheimer, who's also from one of the leading patrician families. So this image of Nuremberg that I'm showing you here is from a hand-coloured copy of the Nuremberg World Chronicle, this extraordinary book from 1493, printed by Anton Koberger, who was Dürer's godfather, and a former goldsmith himself, hence the family connections. But in 1472, he established his printing house in Nuremberg. He could see that there were these wonderful opportunities. And within several years, he would own one of the largest print workshops in Europe with 24 presses, dozens of workers. What he's really well known for, and this is so interesting and important for Dürer, is the production of illustrated books. Technically, economically demanding process, requiring new ways of working, as well as financing and the creation of new markets. So this book, the Nuremberg World Chronicle, had over 1,800 illustrations, kept under lock and key during the production stages. And this book is held in more libraries today. This book, as a book from this period, is held in more libraries today than any other from the era. It's set within a biblical time frame, and it places the reader within a religious setting that anticipates and looks forward to the end times and the day of judgment. Dürer had almost certainly spent time as a young apprentice working or associated with Koberger's workshop alongside his master, the artist Michael Wohlgemuth, whose illustrations for Koberger were really crucial to some of these illustrated books, but Dürer himself was travelling during the core period for this. But let me talk a little bit about religious life in Nuremberg briefly. You can see here the two principal churches. So we've got the St. Lawrence Church, the biggest one today on the Market Square, and then the St. Sebald's Church, which is Dürer's parish church, and Sebald is the patron saint, or was the patron saint of Nuremberg. This is a very important church. So let me move on here. I have this image here. It's a single print rather than a book illustration by Dürer of St. Catherine, because she was the city's unofficial patron saint, particularly beloved by them during the Renaissance, because Alexandria, associated with St. Catherine, was actually a really important trading partner for Nuremberg. One of the most important religious houses in the city was the Katharinen Cloister, which developed a really magnificent library, particularly after it was reformed in the 1420s. One of the other ways in which the religious life of the city was really vibrant was because, again, these great privileges bestowed on the city include the right from the early 15th century to host and annually display the relics, the vestments and insignia of the Holy Roman Empire. So they had been moved from a location near Prague to Nuremberg. And so from 1424 onwards, there was an annual festival. The imperial regalia is connected to Charlemagne, and the relics, of course, are connected to, in particular, Christ's crucifixion. And the key thing that you can see here on this print that was made for pilgrims is the Holy Lance associated with the crucifixion. And these are all on display in the Heilige Geistkirche in Nuremberg. Dürer himself does some paintings connected to that a little later on, although I won't show you those. So there's a lot going on in the city. You walk around it. There's magnificent artworks in the churches. There's stone sculptures, both inside and outside buildings. People are constantly reminded of St. Catherine, of St. Sebald, and of things like the Passion story. What the new wave of book production does is to sort of, add an extra layer of that. And in particular, there are a lot of books with religious content published in Nuremberg, as there are elsewhere, but it's particularly significant, I think, that some of the really great treasures of early printing focus on that in Nuremberg. So on the left, I've got there a page from the Koberger Bible of 1483, again from Anton Koberger, richly illustrated in the German language, filled with scenes of people in local dress and townscapes, as was the fashion in art making at the time. And I've put there a scene from the book of Revelation, which I know we'll return to there. So just look here at the middle, you've got the beast with the 7 heads. And then on the right, I've got a couple of pages, an opening from the Schatzbehalter or treasure chest of 1491. And this was an extraordinary book which told the life story of Christ in visual as well as textual form. So it could be accessed by people with different layers of literacy. They still had to have access to such a beautiful book, but they didn't necessarily have to be scholars. And included mnemonic devices. Like here, you've got these images that show different parts of your fingers are associated with different numbers, so you can remember them more easily, and they relate to each different section of the book. And the book tells this, the story of Christ. This was especially prepared and targeted at women in the convent of St. Clara in the first instance, where the author, Stefan Friedland, was a preacher. So the Reformation, having sort of thought a little bit about this very rich world of visual and material and religious culture in Nuremberg. Dürer was certainly himself. He's absorbed and immersed in all this culture, but he's also watching changes that are afoot in terms of religion, especially in northern Germany. And while he never travelled to Wittenberg, the home of Martin Luther, he had long-standing links with Friedrich the Wise and Wittenberg, producing several altar paintings for the town church that predated Friedrich's support for Martin Luther, but he also did a later engraved portrait of the elector. So he's very alert, as are many of his fellow townspeople, to what's happening in Wittenberg. And when Martin Luther disappeared on his way home from the Diet of Worms in 1521, whisked off into protective custody, this is when Dürer is travelling in the Netherlands, so he's keeping a diary. It's mostly about things like, I paid 20 pfennigs for a bit of cloth, or, but he has this extended distressed section where he records a prayer by an Augustinian prior, Jakob Prost, praying for Luther's release from captivity. So he's very affected by this. Nuremberg itself is one of the first cities to officially and in a civic sense adopt Lutheranism. So in 1524, they make this decision to split with the Roman Church. And this is quite a radical thing, because the city's patrician governing council is economically and socially conservative in many ways. So alongside Strasbourg, they're one of the first cities to accept the Reformation. But I think it's important to point out that there's a great deal of stability there in terms of the religious houses, the visual culture, the material culture of the city. It survives intact, really. It doesn't experience sort of iconoclasm or violent upheavals. These ongoing connections to the Lutheran movement continue, especially through figures like Philip Melanchthon, who gets quite involved in educational reform in the city. And then just to sort of wrap up my long answer to your question, Dürer's own religious position is really frustratingly difficult to pin down in those years between 1524 and 1528 when he dies. Later on, I'll show an image that he produced during the Peasants' War in 1525, and that certainly affected him deeply. But overall, I think people draw the conclusion it's very plausible that he was very sympathetic to the Reformation in general terms. And his portrait prints later in his career included a very famous one of Philip Melanchthon in 1526. But then he does one of Erasmus of Rotterdam in the same year. So he's one of those people who's sort of keeping a mix of things going on. He's sort of not boots all in for the Reformation. So.
Well, thank you for that. I think the discussion of Nuremberg is so important, so interesting, and the work that you're doing now in highlighting the kind of material culture around Dürer is so important and so interesting. That despite religious reforms, this is what he's seeing and experiencing, and that is a kind of medieval Catholic world. You mentioned that all these libraries have the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is a bit of an embarrassment, as I mentioned to you, that we're seeking one, but yet have not acquired one. So we'll let that pass. So I want to move from context to talk about Dürer as artist. You've mentioned to me, you described him as a self-reflective artist. So as we look at some of his work, what do you mean by that? Can you kind of explain what self-reflection looks like in a figure like this?
Absolutely. Let me put up a couple of self-portraits, moving on from him at 13 to him as an adult. There's a few ways of thinking about this. So his two journeys to Italy in the mid-1490s and then a decade later really helped him to develop his sense of the artist as someone who could be a respected figure, a leading figure, and one who had, most importantly, unique creative abilities that marked them out as special in a Renaissance environment. Later in his life, he wrote about the artist's capacity to pour out figures. He's sort of always thinking about what it means to be an artist. Perhaps the most famous thing he says about this is in 1506, when he writes from Venice back home to his friend Willibald Pirkheimer, "Here I'm a gentleman, at home, that scrounger." So he's drawing this big distinction between how an artist in Northern Europe might be regarded. Now, there's quite a bit of exaggeration here, as he's a pretty prominent and successful citizen, but he really enjoys that sense of prestige as a creative person that he's able to get a better sense of through his connections with Italy. One of the ways in which we can see that self-reflectiveness comes through his books, in fact, because the second half of his life, he devoted a great deal of time to his legacy as an artist and to training the next generation of artists through handbooks. And while he never does all the work that he plans to do, I think this is something we can all sympathise with today. He has great plans sketched out, but he does produce, amongst other things, his 4 books on measurement in 1525. And then in the year of his death, 1528, he's completing his work on human proportion, and this is brought to the press posthumously into production by his wife Agnes. So he's very concerned in conveying what he can about what he knows as an artist, or the skills and the insights that he's learned. He wants that to have a legacy. And it's also no accident that he depicts himself repeatedly. I could put up multiple examples of him placing himself as a figure into various artworks, both standalone self-portraits like these ones here, which I'll say a bit more on in just a minute, but also there's lots of paintings of larger scenes, often biblical or early Christian scenes, For instance, one of the martyrdom of the 10,000, where all sorts of terrible tortures are going on, and he's standing there as a sort of Renaissance man, chatting away with his friend, the recently deceased humanist Conrad Celtus. So he's very eager to insert himself into the world of art that he's making, but also the view of historical time and biblical time that he's presenting. He's famously quite proud of his experience, perhaps verging on vain. He buys clothing. His letters record his interest in shoes, in a coat. This portrait here is very famous. If you look into the details, for his, his wonderful hair, his beard, but also the way his fingers just caress that beautiful fur collar. But his self-portraits, and the reason I put these two up, is also develop a final strand of his self-awareness, and that is that he is a figure following in the footsteps of Christ. So this 1500 self-portrait, with its frontal view and his very particular kind of physical appearance, is famously regarded as Christ-like. And later in the 1520s, you can see this personal sketch that he does, where he puts himself in the guise of the man of sorrows. And of course, we know that his health was not great at this time. And one last little tiny thing about the cult of Dürer, not necessarily something he asked for, but after his burial, his body was dug up very rapidly soon after, disinterred by his friends, because they wanted to get a lock of his famous hair. So it took on the status of a relic, I guess, if you like. So yeah, lots of ways in which Dürer gives us rich ways of thinking about who an artist is and how he presents himself or herself.
Fascinating stuff. I love the self-portraits. I think it's a great way to kind of look at what he thought of himself. So you've mentioned a little bit about Dürer's connection to books. You've talked about his production of books and kind of detailing method, but you've also talked about kind of the emergence in the late 15th century of illustrated books and illustrated Bibles. So you've titled our talk today, Devouring the Book, which of course is a reference to an image he creates in the Apocalypse series. And you've recognized that Dürer works in multiple media. So can you talk a little bit about his books, that is his illustrations within books, and how he takes advantage of a relatively new technology, the printing press, to promote a work or his work in a way that may be different from some of his contemporaries?
Thank you. Yeah, I've put a few examples together. This is such a big topic and something that I'm starting to work on now. And a key point to make is that he's the first artist to make his own book, the Apocalypse Cycle, which I know we're going to get to a little bit later. And that's in 1498. But book illustrations were part of his life from his earliest training. And in one way, how he sort of gets a foothold in printmaking while he's traveling as a journeyman in the early 1490s. He contributed his thought. He contributed to a few different books like Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools, for instance, in Basel. And one of the really beautiful aspects of early books and books from this period, and Dürer isn't the only person who does it, but I wanted to just include some examples today, is how reading or the presentation of books is thematized in book illustration. So here's a few examples of that. He's created a series of wood blocks, not printed in their intended form, for an edition of the Comedies by Terence in 1492. So some of these have been carved up and printed later. This is one of the uncarved ones. You can see there it's a wood block. It's got some little holes in it, but the sketch has been done. So here we've got Terence composing in a landscape with his notebook wide open, bringing his books into being. On the right-hand side, this is a title page to an edition of Jerome's letters. So very important religious figure, obviously. The creation of this really wonderful image is contested, although it is in the catalogue raisonné of his work. But the reason I wanted to put it in particular is that he's got, as well as the wonderful image of the lion having the thorn removed, he's got these 3 books with this sort of slightly dodgy but very interesting version of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin texts. So really interesting thing there about Bible translation. More certain are these images, which we were speaking about earlier, Bo, about a Nuremberg edition of plays by the medieval nun Schatzbehalter, and I probably mispronounced that. I'm sorry, I'm not a medievalist, but images which Dürer did for this show, the leading humanist and Dürer's friend Conrad Celtis, who prepared the edition presenting his book to Friedrich the Wise. So Friedrich the Wise we've heard about already, and Wittenberg and his later protectorship of Luther. So that's on the right, but then on the left we've got Roswitha herself presenting her book to Otto I, the emperor in her lifetime. So this idea of books being presented, it's just such a wonderful theme in early book printing, the presentation page. A key series for him, as published both as individual prints and as a cycle, so in a book form, was his Life of the Virgin from 1511. And here you've got Mary, with her prayer books in a scene of the Annunciation. So there's her reading material here. At the same time, Dürer's also doing, around that middle period of his career, he also does 2 cycles of Christ's Passion, the Small Passion in 1511 and the Large Passion around 1497, 1500. So these religious cycles are particularly important for him. Oops, sorry, but I did jump ahead there. I did mention that, of course, later in his life, he's also very concerned with his legacy. And so this is from his book of measurement. It's just got one book on the shelf. I sort of like to think that perhaps Dürer is thinking, with his book, that's all you need. The artist only needs one book. So, but anyway, it's interesting that there's just that one little book there. He also prepared a book on military fortifications. So he's really very much involved in book making. The latter books extensively include text, and he's a really important Renaissance figure as a writer as well. Very few artists have left us the body of writing that he has. The earlier ones are often more about cycles of images, making a sort of artist book, if you like. And he does this to a degree and extent and with a level of control and oversight that is really unusual. He's doing it to a greater extent than other artists are at this time. And indeed, he sort of helps to make this kind of work possible. He creates what we might think of as the fine art book.
Well, let's, you've alluded to it a number of times. Let's jump into that early famous book, The Apocalypse, and tell us a little bit about how we see Dürer at work there, in some sense illustrating a religious text, but kind of taking it in new directions.
So this Apocalypse cycle is just absolutely fascinating, I think. It comes out in 1498, reissued in 1511. It's got 15 images. There's versions with both German and Latin text, and I've got that there. The resolution isn't the best, but what it does show you is how this is actually designed to function as a book with text on facing pages. It's made in the context of apocalyptic expectation approaching the year 1500. Of course, it illustrates the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, and the multiple terrible events that were part of the end times and, foreshadowed the day of judgment. And people had a very strong sense, many people had this strong sense that they were living in the last days. 1498, of course, is also, unfortunately, the year that the Patrician City Council gets permission from the Holy Roman Emperor to, for the second time, expel Nuremberg's Jewish community. So there's a dark underside to what's happening around this period. Now, I've mentioned already Dürer's connection with Anton Koberger, who was his godfather, and he certainly borrowed type and technical knowledge from Koberger's enterprise. And in fact, sometimes the Apocalypse is credited to Koberger's printing house, although in fact Dürer did maintain control as a printer himself. It's not the first time the Apocalypse has been represented, far from it. There's block books and picture Bibles, which had stunning but much cruder images. And I showed you the Koberger Bible from the 1480s a little bit earlier. So what Dürer does really is get this incredible complexity, vitality, skill in incredibly demanding compositions. The carving on wood blocks really takes those images to another level, in which I think this prophetic world of the book of Revelation becomes part of the world around you. So the environment becomes extremely tangible, and all the actions happening within it and the emotional responses of the people within them. And so we've got this sort of cycle of 15 images of extremity, of violence, natural disaster, trumpeting angels sort of unfurling across a sequence of pages. And I love this image. This is John on Patmos. It was John on the island of Patmos, literally devouring the word of God in book form in his solitude. So he's encountering via the angel, the book. And again, this sort of thematizes the incredible growth in bookmaking that characterized the late 15th century. But of course, it also shows the incredible hunger for the Bible. And this would only grow during Dürer's time, of course. And this comes from book 10. So, and, you know, there's that line about the angel says, take it and eat it. It will turn your stomach sour, but in your mouth, it will be as sweet as honey. So he's finding a way to give visual form to that in this quite unique way. But let me show you a couple of other images so you can see what I'm talking about with this incredible drama, complexity, excitement that's going on. On the left, we've got the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And then this is where these 4 horsemen surging into action after the first 4 of 7 seals are opened. John describes hearing the noise of thunder. And so he's got the black horse of famine, the red horse of war, the 3rd horseman with a bow and arrow on a white horse that represents conquest. And then you've got the pale horse of death, accompanied by hell. Dürer, of course, is working in black and white. You do get some hand-coloured editions of these. They always look a little bit odd to art historians because everybody's so used to seeing Dürer in black and white. But the various attributes that Dürer has given to these figures helps them to be identified. And then, of course, people from all levels of society, men and women, are being sort of swept aside, trampled in this dramatic activity. And then lastly, I just put up a favourite of mine, the image of the whore of Babylon on the 7-headed beast of the apocalypse. And she's clutching this vessel, which, as the Bible text said, is filled with the wine of her fornication. So the creature's being worshipped by a group of people from across the social spectrum. And here we've got all this wonderful sort of clothing, and she herself is dressed a bit like a Venetian woman. And one thing that I really like about this is the way that Dürer brings his metalworking background to play here. And she holds the vessel that she holds up is this incredible vessel of exactly the kind that he might have designed had he stayed a metalsmith, a goldsmith. He continued to do some designs that his father, his brother, other people that he knows would have made. And I just put up as an example this little absolutely beautiful late 15th century Southern German cup. So yeah, this is a tremendously influential book cycle and cycle of prints. It's a touchstone for every later version of the Apocalypse that gets made. And of course, speaking briefly, I think, with Piers Careford about the Luther Bible and the illustrations for that, and how Lucas Cranach would go on to do those. And the Book of Revelation was always a perplexing book. And Martin Luther himself had, as you would be aware, he had different thoughts about it and whether it was canonical and whether you should illustrate it and all that sort of stuff. And in the end, they did go down the road of doing it. But of course, the Luther New Testament includes those fascinating anti-papal references, whereas at the time that Dürer is working in 1498, it's sort of every sector of society that's being shown here as needing to respond to the demands of living in the last days.
Yeah, I think our audience is probably more familiar with the Cranach copies in some sense, or adaptations of these. And as you say, is so interesting. I think the imagery of Revelation, the text is just so good. You have to illustrate it, even if you're not crazy about the book itself. You mentioned contextually, as a lot of this is going on, as you said, people have a sense that they're kind of living in the last days. And one of the things we've been discussing throughout the conversation this semester is how in this period, and it's a Protestant move, but it also is later a Catholic move, how nature, signs in nature, but be the positive or negative, are often viewed as kind of signs of larger forces operating in the world. So With Dr. Carefoot, we talked about the monster of Rome and the Tiber River being interpreted as a kind of papal figure. So do you see the same thing with Dürer? That is, do you see things happening around him being interpreted in particular ways artistically?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that I personally have an absolute fascination for and interest in. And Dürer's very much of his time, in that under the reign of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, from Maximilian, following his father, sees himself as the last world emperor. There is a significant level of interest in the disordered natural world and what it means and how you look for signs in the world. And there's all sorts of sort of wider political and religious reasons for that. And Dürer is hearing about all this. I've put up 1492, Sebastian Brandt, the humanist. He did a sequence of broadsheets and pamphlets reporting natural wonders and prodigies. One of them was the Ensisheim meteorite or thunderstone, which fell to the ground and supposedly could be heard for over 100 kilometers away. Who knows? But Dürer was actually potentially within earshot of it, and he was in Basel at this time. So he certainly knew and had contact with with Sebastian Brandt. So he's really being exposed to all these ways that humanists are thinking about the disordered natural world. I've just put up here as well this page from the manuscript, a manuscript about prodigies and wonders that's produced for Maximilian I by a humanist in his employ, Joseph Grünpeck. And here you can see Grünpeck with one of the other court figures standing there having a conversation about all these extraordinary signs in the sky, many of which are connected with Christ, and what they mean for Maximilian's reign. So Dürer has, he's a person of his time in his interest in this, but here's a few examples of things that he produced himself. He's got this wonderful sketch he did of the conjoined twins at Erdingen, which is actually a very beautiful, delicate, respectful sort of sketch, not like some of the images that you see of conjoined children from this time. He's fascinated by, there's a famous monstrous sow of Lanza that Sebastian Brandt writes about. This one may or may not be the same sow. It's there's a bit of debate about that, but again, he's done this unusually respectful image. This is actually an engraving. Pretty much every image that you see of this sort of signs of the disordered natural world would actually be in a rough wood cut, but here he's done this quite fine piece of work. And then on the right, I've got a page from his notebook. It's a single leaf that remains today, and he's done a sketch of the shape that rain fell, so blood rain, which was a phenomenon across all the German lands from about 1501 to 1503, and it fell on the dress of a servant in a friend's household. And of course, it makes this shape of the crucifixion, and that's what he's particularly concerned to record. He also records in the text accompanying that about how soon after there was a meteor in the sky. So he's really looking for the signs of the natural world. And even though in some ways this falls away a little bit, and Maximilian, the emperor, actually sort of loses interest in this as a political tool, but for Dürer, it's still definitely got some personal meaning. This is about a dream that he has rather than a real thing that he sees. But he wakes in the middle of the night. This is 1525. It's during the Peasants' War. So there's a great deal of upheaval. What the Reformation itself might mean is sort of concerning to people during this period. And he has this incredibly emotional reaction. And he writes, in the year 1525, after Whitsun, in the night between Wednesday and Thursday, I saw this vision in my sleep. And he goes on about how terrifying it is and describes it. It filled me with such terror that I woke before the other columns fell, and the water which did fall was immense, some far off, some nearby. It fell with such speed, with such wind and roaring, that in my terror when I awoke, my whole body was trembling, and it took a long time before I properly recovered myself. Then when I got up in the morning, I painted the above picture just as I had seen it. May God direct all things to the best end. So it really shows that Dürer is reflecting through his whole life on the natural world around him, the physical world around him, and he's constantly looking for meanings in his environment. And just to go back to his book cycle, The Apocalypse, you can see here in the opening of the 5th and 6th seals, the moon turning red as blood all over and the sky disappearing like a scroll rolling up as the language goes. How this is a fascination for his whole life. And it's such a hard thing to pin down, right? This sort of sense of environmental disaster and catastrophe. But he gives it sort of incredibly concrete form, actually, in his apocalypse cycle.
Well, and to bring us to contemporary times, right, we might suggest that in our modern culture, we're seeing a lot of this kind of interpreting and signs and things around us as kind of signs of moral decay and this kind of thing. And so one of the things we try to do is to bring historical figures like Dürer and those of the Reformation forward. And so I'm curious, as somebody who studies so deeply a kind of master of visual rhetoric of the past, and I think we're all aware through social media and this kind of thing that kind of visual rhetoric is once again in vogue and so powerful. How do you kind of look at our visual rhetoric today in light of a historical figure like that? Are there things that we can learn from someone like Dürer as we navigate our world today?
Yes, this is a really tough question, Bo, and I think about it from a number of different perspectives. I'm not sure if this answers the question, but I co-teach a subject with a modern historian about the history of violence. And we go from the early modern to the modern week by week. And one of the things we both notice really strongly is that I'm much more likely to put up graphic and violent images, a bit like the ones that Dr. Carefoot included in his discussion recently. And so there is something about how different media allow us to access confronting and violent imagery differently. And I suppose because Dürer is such a masterful artist, he aestheticizes it for some reason. So, in particular ways. I'm not sure if I compare him to the wider visual culture, though I think he would be absolutely fascinated by it. And if he was an artist working today, I'm sure he'd be working in new media because of his incredible skill in forging a new visual language during a media revolution. Like, his flexibility and adaptability is just astonishing. I wonder if perhaps filmmaking is the sort of world that is more appropriate for thinking about someone like Dürer and visual culture today. So rather than single images, that sense of being immersed in an environment that's highly realistic, but also emotionally, manipulative, that wants to lead you through a narrative and control your emotions. You could potentially go down the path of talking about digital gaming, though I'll be out of my depth, so I wouldn't there. But I think it's that idea of world building and creating fascinating images that draw you in with many, many different details, and which you have to see as part of a pattern, which is so important for the apocalypse cycle, for instance, because it's not just singular events, it is things that happen over and over again. I suppose in that way I would connect it to maybe our 24/7 news cycle at the moment, in which we're constantly sort of overwhelmed with how much we're seeing. And with this apocalypse cycle, I think Dürer is playing and controlling the idea of overwhelming his viewer, seeing how much, you just have to look at those images and see he's playing with how much can he pack in, how much can the viewer actually take while he still retains control of the image.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about in a world where you perceive chaos all around you, that someone's able to kind of control that through image creation. Yeah, I like the idea of Dürer as digital gamer right now, and I think it would be fascinating to think if he had the tools around him, such talent, it'd be great. Well, I want to bring us to a close with the question I ask of all of our guests, and it is a self-serving question, so I foreground that. So we're a rare book library. We spend a lot of time, energy, and resources collecting these old works. I know your work in particular depends upon access to repositories and libraries and museums. And some may suggest that in the digital age, right, we just digitize everything, we can share files online, that lessens the import of collecting, of doing things like physical exhibitions. I suspect you would disagree with that. But can you help us understand what the challenges and opportunities of the digital age presents for somebody like you who studies, writes about, and curates exhibitions of old stuff?
Yeah, thanks, Bo. I feel so strongly about this. And in fact, I've spent the last 4 years trying to get an exhibition on Dürer up about this in Melbourne. And our project will soon see one in Manchester. So I feel very passionately that we need to present these things to people so that they get interested in them. Illustrated books are a particular passion of mine because they are so incredibly accessible. They're beautiful. And they cost more at the time that they were produced, of course, but they're incredibly accessible today. They give pathways to people that can't necessarily decode, old German text, or indeed German or Latin. So we need to argue really hard to make these books accessible so that people can see them in person. I think also, especially for younger scholars, particularly those coming through the pandemic, people who've done PhD research without being able to go to an archive or Rare Book Library during that period will now really need the opportunity to be able to go and see things in person and have that haptic sense of what it's like to turn the pages of the book, feel the paper, get a sense of the scale. And of course, as we all know, books work most efficiently as physical objects. Digitized books are just, they're clunkier. They're actually much clunkier to use, particularly if you're looking at books that are, as I do, which are collections of things, which are compendia. So you are meant to dip around in them. You're not meant to sort of start on page 1 and read through from the beginning quite often. So yeah, I think it's really important that people get access. And I suppose one of the things that interests me now with the current project that we're working on, an iconic artist, that's not necessarily the work I've done in the past, is that sometimes we get over-focused on 1 or 2 images that represent a book or a particular artist, and that's sort of the lens through which you see them. And one of the great joys of being able to look at things in person is to turn the pages and get a sense of how the different images interact. Now, that's something where digitization offers an incredible opportunity, of course, to the wider public, because if you put a book on display in an exhibition, you can only have one opening. Maybe you can change it once a week or once a month or something like that, but you can't actually look at the book as a whole. So I think there are those fantastic digitization book services like Gallica or BD16 and so on. And they're very heavily used by specialists, but I think making those things, increasingly user-friendly will be important. But I don't think anything can replace sitting down, touching, smelling, being in the presence of the physical object. Seeing the impression on the page, and realizing that printing is actually a thing that requires pressure and that there's variation across the surface of the page. These are also important, incredibly important things. So I'm encouraged. Yeah.
I was going to say the digital to enhance the physical access is really what's important there. And I think there's a heightened experience now than we live in this digital world to see these physical objects. They actually make more of an impression perhaps than they used to. I always tell people with Dürer, we have some projects going on where we digitize woodcuts and then try to 3D print wood blocks, so to kind of reverse engineer the process. And we can't use a figure like Dürer because his work is far too complex for the computer to handle. So we have to use more rudimentary artists from the time in order to make that work. But anyway, the digital working with the physical, I think, is the way to move forward. And I think the digital has wonderful benefits. We've been able to talk to you across the globe through these technologies, and that's wonderful. But we don't want to close our rare book room, so we'll keep the access going. Well, we are right at our time. I could talk for 4 or 5 more hours, but I think the rest of us, you've got a day ahead of you. We have an evening ahead of us. So I want to thank Professor Spinks for all of your work, particularly the forthcoming exhibition, which I know you will get out there and will be wonderful people to see. I want to remind folks that this conversation, along with all the conversations that we've done, are available online. So please tell your friends and stay tuned for exciting announcement of future programming at Pitt's Theology Library. Thank you very much.
Thank you.